Given that view of the high-level approach followed in the architecture vision phase, let us now take a closer look at an important technique that architects use in this phase to look into the future, a technique referred to as scenario planning or business scenario planning. The technique is typically credited to have been introduced by the American game theorist Herman Kahn in the US, and almost at around the same time, the practice seemed to have emerged in France by the work of Gaston Berger and others. The approach emerged from its academic origins into the corporate world when Royal Dutch Shell established a scenario planning practice to look into the future of their company way back in 1965. It has later been adopted by the wider industry. A 2013 Harvard Business Review article, Living in Futures, states that today about 65 to 70% of large organizations engage in scenario planning to aid their strategy formulation and hence, by extension, architecture development. And this approach has been adopted in other areas of the enterprise such as innovation, risk management, leadership development, and so forth. It is important to note that the concept behind scenarios or scenario planning is not about predicting the future, but rather it is about obtaining a deeper insight and organizational self-awareness which enables the organization to be better prepared to respond to future events. It can be likened to the experience of driving in an unfamiliar and a hilly terrain on a foggy day. A typical driver might respond to this scenario by adjusting his speed and switches on his headlight and stays alert and responsive to possible scenarios that might unfold on the road. The key idea in scenario planning again is to avoid the flaw of planning forward for a future which is not any different from today. Scenario planning encourages preparing for alternate futures that are very likely scenarios. It encourages challenging the comfortable and it treats disagreements as assets. It creates a safe space for planners to acknowledge the uncertainties and discuss plausible realities that might emerge and enable the organization to open new doors of opportunities or to anticipate and neutralize a threat well in advance of them eventuating. Enterprise architecture is essentially a forward-looking function, and a business-led enterprise architecture is closely tied to the strategy formulation and strategy execution function of an organization. Hence, TOGAF recommends incorporating scenario planning techniques into the architecture method in developing the vision for the organization's future. ADM encourages use of scenario planning in all phases of ADM as relevant, with particular emphasis on phases A and B, which are architecture vision and business architecture phases respectively. The typical approach used by enterprise architects to merge business scenario into the architectural development process roughly follow the following sequence of activities. First, understand the business scenario. Second, identify SMART objectives, where SMART stands for specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound. We will discuss more about these objectives shortly. And third is creating a view of the business environments, business processes, actors, and systems that are touched by the scenario. And fourth is identifying architectural principles and constraints that operate in that space currently and identifying their relevance in future as the scenario plays out. Fifth is, based on these understanding, translate the scenario into actionable architecture requirements. As discussed just then, TOGAF recommends using SMART objectives to address the challenges posed by each scenario. Let's examine what this means. Let's examine each of the attribute of the SMART objectives. Specific. Specific implies that the objectives should be unambiguous and clear about the outcomes that are expected from business, architectural, and technology perspectives. Measurable implies that the objectives should define metrics for success. Actionable implies breaking down problems and clarifying them sufficiently to create a basis for finding a solution. Typically, the scenarios are used as a starting point to generate architectural requirements or architectural epics and stories if you happen to be from the agile camp. Realistic implies that architectural objectives and outcomes that are realistic and relevant to the scenario under discussion. Time bound gives clear indication on when the architecture recommendation will expire. And by the way, who creates these business scenarios? Clearly, this is not solely a territory for enterprise architects. The process is usually led by the leadership and strategy teams, with increasing involvement of enterprise architects as the scenarios get more and more fleshed out. It is not uncommon for organizations to engage third-party management consultancies and other specialists in the process of developing business scenarios. Now, let's quickly summarize some of the key benefits of business scenario techniques. Business scenario techniques enhances the ability of business and architecture teams to, number one, perceive change. Number two, understand and respond to change. And thirdly, influence actors early enough to mitigate certain threats and risks. And fourth, it enables an organization to start working on opportunities much before it becomes mainstream. And fifth, it is also viewed as an important tool for organizational learning. In addition to these benefits, this technique also functions as a good starting point for creating architectural requirements. And the application of these techniques is known to help greatly in engaging internal and external stakeholders, especially the business stakeholders, and to help establish good communication with these stakeholders. Now, let's look at the key inputs and outputs of this phase. The key inputs for architecture vision phase are all the outputs produced by preliminary phase. As discussed earlier, these outputs are usually contained within a deliverable referred to as the request for architecture work. To know more about this deliverable and what is included in it, refer to the previous section of this module. The key output of this phase is the creation of some deliverables called the architecture vision document and the statement of architecture work. Architecture vision document primarily captures the architectural vision in terms of the current state capabilities and the first refinement of the envisaged target state capabilities. The baseline and target state capabilities are articulated from business, information systems, and IT infrastructure perspectives, which are further analyzed, fleshed out, and expanded on in the subsequent phases of ADM. The document highlights the gap that exists between current state and target state capabilities and goes into details of the scope. The document also highlights the business scenarios that were considered to envisage the future state of architecture. Statement of architecture work incorporates much of the outcomes from the analysis performed in this phase. The focus is on establishing the business case for architecture work, and hence it is directed at obtaining organizational buy-in and funding for the proposed architecture work. Hence, some of the items that the document incorporates include the key value proposition of the proposed work for various stakeholder groups, build versus buy decision and the outlay of expenditure for procurement and internal developments, progress and performance metrics, understanding of opportunities, risks, threats, issues, etc., and approaches to addressing these. With that, we conclude our discussion on architecture vision phase, and it brings us to the end of the module 4 as well. To recap, to begin with, we first looked at how Tom Weissman is progressing at WebFirst. We focused specifically on his meeting with Lisa Nosovich, where she walks through the strategy of WebFirst Banking Corporation with Tom. We then covered the capability iteration of ADM in the rest of the module, focusing on the preliminary phase and the architecture vision phase. As part of this, we also covered 2 ADM techniques and guidelines that are most relevant for this iteration, specifically around defining architecture principles and also on using business scenario techniques.